Welcome back. Well, yes, indeed, talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, on people. We do have Mr. Kyari joining us this morning. He's a former head of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group. He's an economist. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us today on the program.
Good morning.
Well, we've seen several guidelines. The latest one, they still spoke about some of them yesterday. But if you could, having considered some of those, well, the reason why some say states cannot impose any further or vary in this lockdown is because, look, there isn't just that stimulus package to get to certain people who actually should be getting this. But give us your impression of how the economy is playing out now, because there were several stimulus packages that were announced at the time. Did they make any impact? The jury is out there. But from your perspective, what do you think?
Yes, unfortunately, we do not have a culture of collecting our data as it happens. So the real data would be out much later. By then, it would be too late. However, just on an anecdotal basis, a lot has been shut down, especially in areas that I'm quite aware of, which is the Lagos and vicinity. Industries are closed, hotels, restaurants. So when you look at it, a good deal of the service sector has been down. Of course, I am not quite sure how agri will be affected since the rains have just commenced. But there are some strategic things that need to happen, which is basically injection of the stimulus package into areas that would boost growth. For example, agri is one of such areas. But the key thing is that we do not have enough data to really tell us what's exactly happening with the economy in terms of the palliatives affecting people that are at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, Nigeria is the country with the largest number of extremely poor people. That is, that people that are earning less than the equivalent of about 700 naira per day. We have over 88 million of such people, individuals. And I will bet you that half of those people have to do something every day to put food on the table. Now, the effect of that is that we need to reach out to them quite quickly in terms of the palliatives that need to reach them. However, we do not have the mechanisms in place for doing that. Mobile phones could be one, but then what happens to the person in the rural area? I have heard a lot of things being discussed about bank accounts. Bank accounts are people that have walk-in formal or semi-formal areas. There are millions and millions of people that do not, that are even intimidated to walk into a bank, let alone have bank accounts. So those are the areas we need to look at. The other thing is that the lifting of the restrictions, I know, is done because the economic hardship is really biting hard. And therefore, one has to do something to ensure that people can go out and earn a living. But the important thing is that I know in Japan, they have what they call avoid 3 Cs. Japan, with a population of 120 million, which let's say is less than half, people are predicting dire consequences for Japan. But today, Japan's death rate on COVID-19 is extremely low compared to the population. Confirmed cases are declining. And the reason is very simple. They have a strategy of saying avoid 3 Cs. One is closed spaces. 2, crowded places. 3, close contact with people. Basically, social distancing in another terminology. Now, what they are saying is that go about, do whatever you need to do, but have the discipline of observing that. Now, hopefully, that we will be collecting data as we allow people to start going out, going to the houses of worship, mosques, churches, and doing a few things. but we need to also keep an eye on the new cases, because right now it's not going down. It's somewhere around 300. We have had one incident of about 500 cases in a day, but so far it is around 320, 330. If it remains flat or it starts declining, so be it. It's great. If it starts upticking, then we need to pay particular attention to having a strategy where communication needs to be given to people so that they understand that this thing is here to stay.
Okay. Now, just a quick one on your discussion on data. Well, of course, you are aware that PTF COVID-19 also said that they're going to rely on data and science, to, further some of the decisions they have to take. But, a lot of questions were asked about data on Monday when this whole new phase was to begin. And the question is, which data exactly are we talking about? Because the aviation minister, for instance, will tell you that, look, we have full data of our sector. The banking sector will also say that they have full data of the number of accounts and all of that. So I know that NBS, beg your pardon, is going around gathering all kinds of data. I know that there is deficiency of data, but specifically speaking, in order to fight the economic battles that COVID-19 has brought, what kind of data do we need? You have also said that we need to begin to gather this data. Who should be gathering this data?
Right. So the data that the PTF is relying on is entirely different. They don't really particularly care about the economic data per se. They are looking at the data of how many people, how many tests have been done, how many are infected, et cetera, deaths, and so on and so forth. To that, I would say, yes, they have data. And now, the problem is that even the confirmed cases they are having, for X number of tests, a certain percentage turn out to be positive. I think in the case of Nigeria, it is somewhere around 10% or thereabouts. It may have gone down since the number of tests have started going up now. But we need to do more testing to actually ensure that we closed the door before the fox got in, kind of. But on the economic data, yeah, NBS is the source of most, all of our data that officially comes out from the government. Now, NBS's data is a bit delayed. I mean, the data for the month of May will not be released until probably towards the end of June. That's what I mean by data that comes out a little bit late is not quite the same as data that you get fresh on a daily basis or weekly basis. Now, that's what I mean by having the issue of dealing with data that has lagged behind. It's like you're driving, looking at the rear view mirror. When you continuously look at the rear view mirror, meanwhile you're going up forward, you will have no idea where you are headed. Now, essentially, that data that we need for economic purpose is to, share the data. For example, aviation. How many commercial flights have taken off and landed in Nigeria in the last 1 month? 0. So we do have the data. That basically means that millions and millions of, billions of naira is being lost. But it is not just the planes taking off and landing that is the key data. There are a lot of activities at the airports. Those are also economic activities. People that go in, eat there, drink there, whatever, those are all economic activities that add to the GDP. Now, when that is not happening for a considerable period of time, it has its effect. And those are the effects that we're seeing in the hardships that people have. Now, how then do you alleviate that? Of course, you then say, okay, damn the consequences, let's open the economy and let's push. But that may also be counterproductive because health comes first. Health before wealth. Now, the critical piece there then is that how do we balance it? And it has to be done with a lot of care caution, and people must be made aware of what they must do if they have to go out and interact. How many people should there be in any gathering, etc., etc. Because at the end of the day, the best thing that we can do for our citizens is to safeguard their health, and then the wealth component comes later. So essentially, it is a situation of you do it, you're damned, you don't do it, you're damned. But we have to navigate through those difficult choices, and I hope that the easing of restriction will give a little boost to the economy. But at the same time, we need to still stay on giving out that clear message about COVID-19 so that people are aware and people take it to heart and change our previous habits such that the new habit or the new normal that has evolved, such as not shaking hands or not hugging or whatever, need to be understood by people. And we're doing that as a result of the savings of lives rather than anything else. There is really no other underlying motive other than to safeguard the lives of the citizens of Nigeria.
Right. Now, listening to the PTF yesterday, I mean, the coordinator had to say that COVID-19 is not over, especially because we've moved into another phase and there's a tendency for people to think, oh, thankfully, we've left that behind, so let's move on. By the way, I even drove around, tried to look at people complying with wearing their face masks, for example, and, the physical distancing. And what I saw was quite shocking because it appeared as though a lot of people have thought or are thinking we've left the worst behind. But looking at the data we have, which you say the PTF is looking at, for example, 75% of the current confirmed cases, that's about 7,500, is as a result of community transmission. You see that we've only tested over 65,000 of 200 million people. That is a huge gap. You see that 812 healthcare workers have been, infected, which is a challenge we were talking about, overwhelming our system such that, healthcare workers are also affected, the ones that are meant to be in the front lines. I mean, I can go on and on, over 40,000 pieces of PPEs purchased. When we have just about 40,000 doctors, imagine the nurses, and this is not something they can use over time. It's meant to be for a few times and then they change. So there's inadequacy in that extent. Lagos State is saying that they're bringing out guidelines before businesses can open. But when you look at the compliance on one hand and the stark reality of the data we have, how do you propose we handle having people to comply, to imbibe this, and opening businesses at the same time?
Yes, Lagos State at least is at the forefront, and of course, Lagos being the hotspot in the country. Go up north, I think the incident of wearing masks is much lower, well, apart from possibly Abuja. And the reason basically is that, one, it may be lack of those PPEs, but at the same time, it may also be because the communication of how serious and urgent, how serious and dangerous this virus is. Exactly the case that PTF has always been constantly repeating. That is that the virus is here, and unless such a time after a vaccine is discovered, by the way, even if a vaccine is discovered, we may be way behind the queue. Look at the number of tests we are doing. It's much smaller than what you would call for a country the population of Nigeria. Now, the luck we have is that I believe that this may actually be my own hypothesis. I believe that this virus followed the key travel routes across the globe. So Africa having about 2% of the global travel means that we were affected less by it because all of the cases, of course, are flown in from somewhere. And in our case, particularly in Nigeria, it is mainly from Europe and the US. And of course, it may be a few from China before we really knew that we had it. But most of it that had been identified and traced were specifically coming from Europe and the US. Now, the issue that we are faced with is, number one, we're lucky that the numbers are not as overwhelming as other countries of similar sizes. Two, we have a situation where we already are starting on a very bad note, which is that we have a poor and extremely poor healthcare system. So to inundate our healthcare system is very easy. All you need to do is say, we need 10,000 ICU beds. And I don't think Nigeria as a whole has that kind of number. And so the luck on our side is that the numbers are not as high as it is. And it continues to be trudging along in that flattened 300 or so per day number. But at the same time, the critical pieces of PPEs that our healthcare workers or the frontline workers need is also few and far between. One or two of the companies that I chair donated specifically to the healthcare workers, PPEs basically. And the reason that we felt it was an HMO and an insurance company. The HMO felt that this is something that is within that industry and we need to do something. And of course, the insurance company on our own did one thing, but also collectively through NIA, we also did something in alleviating the sufferings of our people. But the problem, though, is that it is a case of what we need to do early enough. Let's suffer a bit.
So that Mr. Kyari, if I could jump in there, you know, that's where the concern really is, because look, some things that we've identified now. The SGF did say, while it was in the National Assembly, they didn't know that the health sector was this bad. They've identified that. The Minister of Labour in some fora was saying unemployment rates may hit 33.5% in 2020, another point of identification. And then the Aviation Minister, in that brief, one of the briefings, says we lose 21 billion naira monthly. Now, they identified all of this, but they've not said, what are they going to do about some of these things specifically? So, from your perspective, I mean, looking at the big picture, because there'll be so many losses, job losses too, what should we be doing?
I think for now, one of the key things that on the monetary side, both on monetary and fiscal side, what we need to do is that the country's economy right now, there is really very little space on the fiscal side. That is, that if the government wants to spend money, the government doesn't have money, it has to borrow. Now, and we have seen the moves being made by the Minister of Finance and many other things that we are hearing. So the debt that Nigeria is incurring, both domestic and foreign, some of it are going to go into those, I would assume. Hopefully, it would go it needs to be spent very quickly, because without money circulating, the decline of economic activities will actually overwhelm the economy. And it needs to be done quick and in large amounts. So however it is done, whether it is going to be a domestic bond issues like the Sukuk 150 billion Sukuk, unfortunately, in the case of Sukuk, which is an Islamic bond, it has to be borrowed and spent on what is going to be spent on. So in that case, unless it is specific to say that we're going to feed people with it, it's money that would go into infrastructure. But some of these
Mr. Kyari,
borrowing...
Just one moment. Maybe we could just be... Just one moment. We could just be giving ourselves excuses to borrow, if you don't mind me saying, from what you're saying now. Why do I say this? Because there are tremendous resources in Nigeria. You have said that so many times. If there is a need, what if there is a need to tweak some laws to jumpstart some things? For instance, you have spoken several times about the huge, tremendous mineral resources at the state levels. Isn't that some kind of low-hanging fruit that we can tweak some laws or find a way to jumpstart some activity in? That's so that, I mean, if we're able to get that done, I mean, it'll be quick money in the economy, wouldn't you say?
Correct, but those are not quick money. It requires equipment to buy. I mean, unless you're going to go and do artisanal mining, which is extremely dangerous, unregulated, and you may not even capture the data of what are the gold and topaz and zircon or whatever mineral that you're getting. How many and how much have you mined? Mining also requires a certain level of investment. It takes a certain amount of time, so there is a gestation period. I mean, if you get a mining license, from the time, depending on the mineral, from the time you apply and get the license to the time you start producing, it could take 1.5 to 2 years. Now, it is a good business for people that have the resources. So not everybody can go in there. Now, meanwhile, agri is something that most people can do. In fact, majority of the employable or employed population in Nigeria are farmers. And that is something that can achieve two things. One is that at least we will produce to feed ourselves, but it also has a time lag, isn't it? Because if the rains start today, it would probably take you 2-3 months before you get a harvest. Now, all of those are things that require time, and let's invest in those. And even if we are going to borrow to invest, let's do so. But what happens tomorrow? There are 200 million mouths that need to be fed tomorrow. How do we do that? Now, some do have the means, and some even help their neighbors. But there are a lot more that cannot afford to even eat. So how do we address those? Those are the things that the government can. The worst thing that can happen is for government to print money, which literally is what some of the economies in the world are doing. US is printing money, basically. Over $6 trillion, $3 or $4 trillion in the financial and capital markets, and another $2 to $3 trillion in the fiscal space, where they are pumping palliatives, directly giving money to their citizens.
Okay. Mr. Kyari, just one moment. Just one moment. Now, you have talked about, what's pretty much central decisions. Is there a role for states, very, very quickly before we take a break, is there a role for states in all of these to jumpstart the economy and put quick money in the economy?
Now, the dire states of the states, no pun intended, is basically that we have identified that majority of our states are not even viable economic entities in the first place. This is basically a double whammy for them. They've been squeezed. IGR is going to go down considerably. In some cases, it may go down by 50, 60, if not 90%, because a place like Lagos, things have to happen before the government gets money. And meanwhile, they are still spending money, trying to do all the things that they need to do. So the reality is that we need to even rethink whether the states, as they are constituted now, are viable economic entities. If they are not, is it possible to have what I would call a serious conversation about Nigeria, to have maybe 6 zones or whatever the number is, but reduce it to a meaningful number? That way, at least your recurrent expenditure is down. There is also economic viability of minerals and agri and, comparative areas of comparative advantages in those 6 geopolitical zones. I believe that NESG has a document regarding this political zones are economic viabilities.
I think we'll have a second look at that then.
Right.
All right, so
it's only when you are down that you be creative.
Well, we just have to keep doing what we have to do, don't we? Well, we do thank you for talking to us this morning, Mr. Abuka Kyari, former chairman of the NESG.
Thank you.
All right, then we're back in a moment. Don't go away.